Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 23, Americans and the Great War. This is approximately 1914 to 1919. Grateful, the Great War does refer to World War One. It's not just a great Taylor Swift song. And so today we're going to be looking at these 3 points with World War One: isolationism and American entry, Woodrow Wilson, and the post-war America. So getting into it, we're going to talk about isolationism and American entry. How do we go from being our own nation on this side of the world, Monroe Doctrine, to all of a sudden we're fighting in a war in Europe across the world from us? This is in your textbook. It's a timeline essentially of American entry into World War One. I'm going to point out a few things here. So obviously, this event here, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is the thing that actually launches World War One. And we're not going to go into super detail here, but basically, World War One erupts because that event happens, and then all kinds of treaties and defensive pacts are then called into play, and essentially, countries are forced to honor their word or break their promises, break their treaties with other countries. And so, almost overnight, the entire continent of Europe is at war with each other, with countries all over. It's not necessarily your neighbor that's on the same side as you. So it's a very dramatic shift overnight very quickly, and these countries immediately fully go into war. Um, and along with that is a couple of things that are happening. The biggest one that concerns us is the idea of neutrality, of being isolated, right? Of being not part of this event that's occurring. So the official stance, the official position of the United States government is one of neutrality. Now, when we say neutrality, it's really just on the surface level, and it's because we didn't want to come out and publicly and say it. And why not? Because the American people were very anti-war. Um, it's fairly recently that American people have been um, vocally pro-war. The major sentiment through majority of time is anti-war, unless absolutely pressed. So, for instance, World War One, we do not join until almost to the end of the war, and because something specifically happens to America to anger the people enough. A similar situation in World War Two, and then and currently the second Iraq War, obviously launched by the terror attacks on 9/11. So it's really in these, like, once something specifically happens to America, that's when we're more likely as a nation to say, yes, I agree, we should go to war. But at this time in 1914, when the war pops off, that's not this general sentiment of the country. We're very against it. We're very like, that's a European problem. That's why I left Europe. That's why I left in now a citizen here. So it's a very much a let's keep it at arm's length. Let's see how this goes, but not really pay attention to it kind of thing. Um, with neutrality, there are still there is still trade with all of these countries who are at war with one another, but not to the same extent. So, what does that mean? Well, the government secretly begins to limit trade and communication with the countries that it believes are the aggressors of the war, and starts to rely more heavily on the people it sees as morally righteous, morally defending themselves in this war, who happen to be our longtime allies, Britain and France and the rest of their allies throughout this war. And with that, the Germans are not stupid. They pick up on it pretty quickly. And they had a long time a history of secret U-boat, secret submarine attacks throughout all of the waters, essentially, that are open to them. And so this escalates to attacks on any trade ship, whether no matter what flag it's flying. I mean, obviously they don't attack other German trade ships, but it doesn't matter that the U.S. is officially neutral. If they see a U.S. trade ship bringing goods to England or to France, they're going to shoot it and sink it. And so, probably one of the most famous events of this war is the sinking of the RMS Lusitania here. While it was a this is a ship that is a passenger ship, which had not been. This is the first recorded deliberate attack of a passenger ship during this war. Um, and the reason that the Germans attack it is not officially known, and it's will never truly be confirmed. But the one of the theories based on analyzing the wreckage as well as contemporary reports at the time is that it was not carrying just passengers, it was also carrying weapons. And that's concluded by the nature of the explosion and how much it explodes and how few survivors there were. That's kind of where that theory emanates from. But needless to say, even though lots of American passengers were killed in that attack, it's not enough to really push us over the brink. It's not until 1917 down here that Germany really messes up, and Germany tries to send a telegram to Mexico to try to get them to launch a war against the United States with the promise that once the war is over, Germany will allow Mexico to have back all of the land that America took from them in the last Mexican American War, which would be Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, places like that. This is intercepted, however, by intelligence agents in London, who then send it over to America, but also get it printed in every American newspaper that they can get their hands on. And so the American public wakes up to this telegram, seemingly unprompted to them, of Germany trying to launch a second front in this war in the United States. And that is what pushes the American people over the edge and really pushes them towards agreeing and wanting this war that happens. And so Congress and Woodrow Wilson immediately pick up on it and will officially enter America into the war. Now, when we talk about isolationism and this idea of neutrality, it's a an idea that really ebbs and flows throughout American history. The idea that America should not concern itself with anything not in American soil or on American soil, but also something that then we don't always follow depending on what exactly the situation is and what's going on. You can think of our several involvements in South America and Latin America as prime examples of this. And this, to a lot of people, is the same sort of event, that this is something that does not concern America. The citizens represented here by the little boy dressed up with a USA hat is being pulled by Woodrow Wilson into the Temple of Peace, where you can see all of Europe, these European flags and European dress here, kind of having a time, right? We're not really sure if it's a good time or a bad time, but they're having a time, and Woodrow really wants to bring America into this group, right? Whatever they're doing here. And you see him here, it says, President Wilson, now come along and enjoy yourself with the other nice children. I promise that you'd be the life and soul of the party. And that's the idea. That's the key takeaway right there from this political cartoon, that the idea that America is the moral police, that there's a way to morally interact with and work with other nations. Now, while that may be true, and it's mostly up to individual judgment, um, what is true is that it's really difficult to stay that moral road when no one else agrees with your morals. And that's not necessarily talking about American people, but when the people who you're trying to work with in other countries don't have the same morals as you, causes a problem. And that's what Wilson runs into, that he has to backtrack a few times, that he says one thing when he's trying to get elected, and then once elected, he is like, no, let's go to war. I actually, JK, everything I said on the campaign trail. And so that's the basis behind this particular cartoon, is that he's really pushing and pulling American people to war, which is what the perception is, up until we get that Zimmerman telegram. And then that's when it's actually fully pushed over the brink and says, okay, maybe this is worth something. Maybe we should follow Wilson here. And eventually, war will be declared. This is a front page headline from a newspaper of the time, from Alabama. And it says, war is declared. The president calls for volunteers. United States joins allies against Germany. And then over here, United States now needs men. German fleet is held. Big army planned. Preparations for entering the War of Nations hurried in every quarter. And then here, in turn, German liners are seized. House by vote of 373 to 50 after all-night session backs president. So lots going on here. The as soon as America declares war, it immediately switches over into wartime production and manufacturing, which it had not had to do in the modern era, so past 1900. And so it is fully into this war effort. There are immediately plans and drafts and all kinds of full mobilization for war that occurs in the United States almost overnight. And we also start making non-neutral acts officially, such as interning and seizing German ships that are harbored in our ports around us. And so let's talk about Woodrow Wilson. Oh, Woodrow Wilson here. He is a president who has a very interesting history with foreign policy. He tries to really make America the moral compass and the moral police of the rest of the world. And he does not really succeed at it, right? His first attempt is in China when China's at war with Japan and tries to mediate for them. It does not go well. It does because he doesn't understand the culture and the historical significance of the conflict between China and Japan at that time, and thinks he can just solve it by saying, "Oh, war is bad. Follow America. We never have wars." He tries again in Mexico, and that also is ultimately unsuccessful. And so he sees Europe as just another chance for him to really make a name for himself and for America as like the people that the rest of the world should look to for all of their answers and any problems that they end up having. And he's kind of misguided in this approach. He just assumes that everyone will just follow him because he is the American president. And these other nations will listen to him, but won't necessarily follow him and take everything that he is saying. He kind of fails to understand that they have their own full, rich histories and cultures and years of ways of living and interacting with people that come and last way longer than Woodrow Wilson and way longer than America. That doesn't stop him. He devises this list of 14 points here, which are the 14 reasons why America is going to this war that it really doesn't have any attachment to. Again, the only reason we're joining this war is because of the telegram that's intercepted. And so he still needs to kind of say, okay, but what are we doing? Why are we going to war? An important thing in launching a war is having your war aims, your war goals. And we don't always have that, especially in modern wars. And by modern, speaking of anything after World War II, there's really no war aims. There's no tangible goals on why we are taking this specific action and why we are actually engaging militarily with another sovereign nation. But Wilson tries his best here. He gives us his 14 points, his 14 things that he wants to accomplish in foreign policy and with this war. That's open diplomacy. Everybody should just have the same government system as America and follow exactly the American style democracy and diplomacy that we have. Freedom of the seas, so no more sneaky submarines hanging out everywhere. Removal of economic barriers, so he thinks he can just say, wave his hand and there will be no economic challenges to anything in Europe. Reduction of armaments, so reduction of weapons and standing armies that peaceful countries have outside of war. Adjustment of colonial claims. He basically wants everyone to get rid of their colonies, their imperial nations, or imperial islands and colonies. Sorry, I don't know why I couldn't think of that word I was trying to say. But he will not say that America needs to get rid of ours. He wants conquered territories in Russia, so he thinks that Russia is too big and that we should divide it up a little bit there. The preservation of Belgian sovereignty, so he supports Belgium being its own sovereign nation. Restoration of French territory because Germany had taken over parts of Germany. Redrawing of Italian frontiers, division of Austria-Hungary, redrawing of Balkan boundaries, limitations on Turkey, establishment of an independent Poland, and creation of an association of nations. So if you look at a lot of these, he thinks he can just change and fix Europe with a mark of his pen, right? He is he's looking at this war and why it started and kind of getting the reason, but kind of not, right? Not getting the real meaning behind it. That he thinks he can just redraw borders and that will solve everything. Give people their independence and that will solve everything. Divide this country that has a long-standing being united. That will solve everything, and it doesn't. It doesn't. One thing he does accomplish is this League of Nations, which we can see here. It is essentially the United Nations before there's a United Nations. It's the precursor to the United Nations, which I always find so ironic that Wilson pushes this through. He says, this is what will protect the world. This is what we all need. And then America does not join it because it needs to be approved by Congress. And he was not friends with people in Congress at the time. So they kind of vote against America joining this just to spite him at the end of it. And so, speaking of America and this post-war and the League of Nations, what happens? Well, the World War One is the first time that we start to see some shifts in civil rights in the United States. In the United States, this is the first time that Black people are able to join any armed forces as a regular recruit. And so you can see here we have a picture of a group of men from the Navy. The Navy at this time is um, the one and only branch that allows for Black people to serve in their own regiments. They do also need to be commanded by a white commander, so it's not fully gone, but it's some progress. But what does this mean for America? Well, these boys are all shipped off to Europe. They fight. They are received extremely well in Europe, especially in France. They are treated and received in a way that they have never been treated as before. And so, at the conclusion of the war, a good amount of Black men will stay in France and make their lives in France following the war. Those that come back to a different experience. Those that were stationed in Europe experienced essentially as close to equality as they had ever experienced before. There were no segregated facilities, there were no segregated water fountains, things of that nature. And so they experience that. They say, hey, it is possible. Hey, it does work. We're here. We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting for, Europe to get along and treat each other peacefully and equally. And then they come home and are slapped right back into their same harsh realities. Um, while they're still allowed to stay in the Navy, they no changes to segregation, no changes to any Jim Crow laws, no changes to any lack of respect or access for these men. And so, what ultimately happens is this taste of equality that then they lose as soon as they come home. And that is going to be a big thing that spurs the civil rights movement to really get its start and to really start pushing forward at this time. And then, of course, at the end of the war, every war has to end with a peace treaty. And so this one has another Treaty of Versailles. And Wilson is there for the talks. Wilson, though America is not in the war for very long and also did not really lose much or suffer many casualties during the war, he's given an equal place at the table with France and England and Germany. And so this will mean that the Treaty of Versailles is very close to Wilson's 14 points. That he um wants some things to happen and he tries his hardest to get them through. And so the things that he's really fighting for are here: an end to secret alliances, freedom of the seas, reduction of economic barriers and tariffs, reducement of armaments, and self-determination for all countries and peoples, meaning colonies are allowed to independence, colonies are allowed to rule themselves. What ends up happening is this circle, right? The Treaty of Versailles is strong armed by France and England, and Germany is forced to accept blame, complete and total blame for the war, and they're required to pay the total cost of World War One to France and England. They have to pay reparations to all of these other countries. Germany is also forced to reduce its size of its standing army to almost nothing. Their colonies are taken away, but they're not given independence. They're taken away and given to its ally to split up between Britain and France and their allies. Austria-Hungary is divided into four independent countries following this as well. And then, of course, the League of Nations is created. That's their little concession to Wilson at this time. What ends up happening is because of this Treaty of Versailles, it puts us directly on course for another world war. And that's where we're going to get when we get to World War II. The punishments from the Treaty of Versailles are so harsh and so extensive on Germany that they literally cannot recover from this. That they are essentially a nation that is not allowed to move forward or to correct itself. And so what ends up happening is that it just pushes them further and further and further into radicalism, as we'll see in a few chapters when we get to World War II. And with that, that'll be the end of lecture 23 for World War One. As always, if you have any questions, pop them into the questions forum or send me an email and I'll be happy to answer them. But I'll leave you with that here and I'll see you back here next time for lecture 24.